Welcome everybody to the Stakeholder Advisory Group quarterly meeting for the Dinuba Wellfield Remedial Investigation and Feasibility Study Project. Just a couple of notes. Number one, this meeting is being recorded and we will make it available on the project webpage on the City of Dinuba's website. And we'll also send it out to all the Stakeholder Advisory Group contact list. And then if you have any comments or questions during the meeting, please feel free to either type those in the chat or ask them during the meeting. It's pretty informal, so we are open to having, discussion as we go through all of the content. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Raker with Formation Environmental to get us started.
Okay, welcome folks. I encourage you to go to our website to learn more about the project. But I am going to give you the funding disclosure here, which is that this project was funded partly by Prop 1, the Water Quality Supply and Infrastructure Improvement Act of 2014. And the contents of this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views and policies of the foregoing, nor does mention of trade names or commercial products constitute endorsement or recommendations for use. Okay, here's our agenda for our meeting today. I'll talk about the project review to give folks that are not familiar with this project a brief introduction to our project. Then we'll talk about the schedule and upcoming milestones. Then the primary focus of the meeting today is to discuss the feasibility study. So we'll talk about the approach, the technology screening, implementation, project alternative evaluations and ranking, our preferred project, and then the next steps. So just as a review, for the goals and objectives of this project received $1.7 million from Prop 1 in order to study and develop potential implementation options to clean up or prevent the spread of non-point source water pollutants in the Dinuba Municipal Wellfield. We identified an effective means to address nitrate, DBCP contamination, and 1,2,3 TCP contamination in groundwater, which are widespread in the shallow aquifers in the region. And the purpose of the project was to identify which project could be funded under future implementation grants to help assure a more secure and higher quality water supply for the city. So here's an overview of the project milestones and the schedule for upcoming work. We submitted the draft remedial investigation report to the Technical Advisory Committee in November. We have received comments and we are now in the process of revising the draft RI report to prepare the final RI report for submittal and approval. We also prepared the groundwater modeling technical memorandum, which is an overview of the groundwater model and identification of contaminant transport. That was submitted also in November, and I believe we have received comments from Robin, and thank you, Robin. We'll keep this open to see if other folks have additional comments, and then address those comments and revise it and submit the final version. And then the draft feasibility study report that we're presenting today will be submitted sometime this week. Two other items is that an update. The last time we presented, we had requested a schedule extension from October 2021 to January 2022, and the state has approved that. Great. And then also just a reminder that there's a Prop 1 grant program round 3 application that's going to be coming out in January. and that is very important to this project because we'll be able to submit our application to see if we can implement and get funding for that. And then this chart below just shows you the deliverables that we've prepared for this project, and the green indicates that these are ongoing. We have not finalized them yet. On the far right side, the project closeout documents will be the final deliverables for this grant. Now I'll hand it over to Mike Tietze, the project director.
Well, welcome everybody. The next couple of slides will also be kind of a review and introduction to the feasibility study approach. So this particular slide gives an overview of the entire project process, and it began with compiling and collecting data that were presented and analyzed in the remedial investigation, and that's been completed. And the purpose of that was to feed into development of a groundwater model and conceptual understanding and provide the context for the feasibility study. So in preparation for the feasibility study, Provo and Pritchard have performed an engineering evaluation of various different alternatives and developed screening criteria. And then there was a identification of different technology options. Those were screened and developed into implementation alternatives, and then analyzed and ranked, and then the final outcome is a preferred implementation project. The first step in the feasibility study process is the identification and screening of different technology alternatives. Those are basically just the general types of approaches that could be used at any site where you're dealing with these kinds of non-point source contaminants. And those are then screened against threshold criteria that include regulatory compliance, community and acceptance, risk and uncertainty to the extent that some risks and uncertainties would be unacceptable, and then finally implementability. And the implementability piece, some projects may not be implementable. So this first screening step allows us to better assess what general types of approaches are even feasible. And then the surviving alternatives in the second step, where we identify and analyze implementation project alternatives, we take the surviving technologies and we assemble them into implementation project scenarios in the city, together with input from the city. And then we evaluate those for performance using our fate and transport model. We develop feasibility evaluation criteria, and we use those criteria to evaluate and score and rank the alternatives. And then with that semi-quantitative ranking approach, we define the top-ranked project, and we assemble the preferred project from the outcome of that. So we refine the preferred project from that feasibility scoring and ranking. And then on that, Provo and Pritchard have prepared the conceptual design and the conceptual concept. With that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, I'm Steve Spencer with Provo and Pritchard. I'm going to talk a little bit about the screening the alternative screening that we did. So in a typical feasibility study, we would look at various technologies for treating contaminants in the groundwater. And we did that here. We also, because of the nature of the project, the expanse of the groundwater beneath the city of Dinuba, we also included in our technologies Aquifer Recharge, a couple of different kinds of Aquifer Recharge. So the technologies then are compared against these four. We're compared here against these four threshold screening criteria, and basically on a pass-fail status. So if they pass, they would potentially move on to the next stage of our project, and if they fail, then they were eliminated from future consideration. So regulatory compliance, generally by state and local regulators, whether it meets the state standards for drinking water, that sort of thing, surface water. Community acceptance, so even if a technology doesn't meet or does meet the state standards, at least how they're typically managed, it's potential that the community themselves, the wider community, may not accept it, high cost, taste and odor, that sort of thing. Implementability, whether a technology actually would address the contaminants that or the constituents of concern beneath the city of Dinuba. And then risk and uncertainty are combined together. So risk is risk to potential risk to water quality, unintended consequences that would accrue if we use a certain technology. And then uncertainty covers a lot of ground. For instance, if we were relying on raw water delivered from surface water deliveries, some uncertainty whether that water is available. So those are the threshold screening criteria. So the next slide basically summarizes the results of our screening. So those technologies that pass through that we're going to talk about in the next step here about turning into projects that may be used to benefit the groundwater beneath Dinuba. Ex situ treatment, meaning basically pumping the water out of the ground and removing contaminants, constituents of concern. Well modification, wellhead treatment, those sorts of things, administrative controls, pumping schedules, for instance, and then aquifer recharge, managed aquifer recharge, or surface impoundments. Things that, technologies that ultimately did not pass the screening, no action, of course, in situ treatment, things like injecting oxidants or biologicals into the ground to destroy contaminant, pumping and discharge to the wastewater reclamation facility for the city of Dinuba. We can get into some more details if you'd like, but public discharge to AID canals was not implementable, and aquifer storage and recovery. All of those technologies were ultimately discarded at this phase and aren't going to be considered in the future. So at this point now, I'd like to turn it over to Kelly McInerney to discuss the projects that we assembled from these technologies.
All right, so I'm going to be going through the 6 projects that we identified based on the approved technological approaches that Steve just covered. And before I get into the projects, I'm going to go over some terminology that we're going to be using for the groundwater depths. So we refer to the shallow zone, and that will cover depths 0 to 230 feet. And then we have the upper deep zone, which will be from 230 feet deep to 400 feet deep. And then the lower deep zone will be beyond 400 feet deep. So then in scenario 1, this was a project that we identified using Aquifer Recharge. This project was actually laid out in the Groundwater Sustainability Plan by the Kings River East GSA in 2019, and it identified groundwater recharge from the Smithtown Ditch, which is an AID canal in the northeast part of town. So we identified land at the very northeast corner of the city limits, as you can see in that red shaded box. This land is not currently owned by the city, but this was 60 acres that we identified that would be close to the Smithtown Ditch. And there we modeled infiltration over those 60 acres. So this is the Aquifer Recharge scenario. And then in the second scenario, we will be utilizing administrative controls for TCP mitigation. So currently at well 14, there is already GAC treatment for removal of TCP. So in this scenario, we're recommending maximizing the pumping at well 14. So that would increase pumping from 597 million gallons per year to 735 million gallons per year. And with that increase, it would then decrease pumping at wells 16 and 20, which are the two closest wells to well 14, to handle that extra pumping at well 14. Also, as part of this scenario, we looked at well 21, which is in that western part of the city. This is a well that will be drilled within the next few years. And there is the potential for TCP in this area, since we know that in areas north of the well, there is currently detectable TCP. So we've proposed installing a deep well as in addition to a shallower well in the upper deep zone. And this would help to mitigate the transfer of TCP in the drawdown of that well. So in the next scenario, scenario 3, we would be utilizing well modification as well as land application to mitigate nitrates. So currently the wastewater reclamation facility is infiltrating a large volume of their treated water from the facility. And initially the RCR well was installed near the golf course and near the reclamation facility to capture nitrates. So that well was a shallow well, so typically nitrates are found in the shallow zone. However, with that large volume of water being infiltrated at the reclamation facility, the nitrates have actually been kind of forced down lower into the deeper zone. So the current RCR well is pumping good, clean water. So we've proposed installing a new well in the same area as the current RCR well, but into the deep zone. And then the current RCR well would either be abandoned or left as a standby well based on the preference of the city. So then the water that's pumped with the new RCR well would be capturing those nitrates from the deep zone, and the water would be applied as irrigation for the golf course, as well as a new proposed park in that area. And the turf at the golf course and the park would help to uptake the nitrate and therefore clean up the water that's going back into the aquifer. All right, and then in scenario 4, we'd also be utilizing pumping and land application for nitrates. So in this scenario, we've identified 4 different areas where there are parks, schools, and just other recreational fields. And at each of these areas, we are proposing installing shallow groundwater wells that would provide irrigation for those respective playing fields and parks. And the goal is that the water that would be applied as irrigation water would have the nitrates removed through uptake from the turf, and then that would clean up the groundwater by removing the nitrate-laden water in the shallow zone, and then also have the vegetation of the fields uptake the nitrate as fertilization. And then in scenario 5, we have another Aquifer Recharge project. And this project would be utilizing the existing 3 basins near well 14. These 3 basins have an area of 30 acres, and we would also be adding an additional 10 acres in the north and west area of those basins, kind of in that L shape there. We would also install a pipeline from Centennial Park to the existing well 14 basins. Currently, Centennial Park serves as a stormwater basin just during times when the city gets big storms into the city, but that water is ultimately pumped into the nearby Horseman Ditch. So instead of pumping the water into the Horseman Ditch, then the water would be redirected to the basins where it could be infiltrated. Water from the AID canal to the east, which is the Dinuba Town Ditch Canal, that would provide water periodically as AID had capacity, and then that water would be infiltrated over those 4 basins. Additionally, there would be 2 groundwater wells installed south of the basins, and those would each be 400 feet deep, and they would provide 400 acre feet of water annually. And those wells are part of the city's expansion plans for their non-potable water. And then scenario 6, we also looked at Aquifer Recharge, and this would be utilizing the city's current stormwater retention basins. However, in a 2019 drainage basin capacity analysis performed by AECOM, there were 8 basins that they identified that had capacity for expansion. So those 8 basins are circled there on the map. And with the proposed expansion in that analysis, there would be an additional 457 acre feet of capacity added. And currently, the city has to pump water from the stormwater canals to the AID canals and lines because these stormwater basins cannot hold the volume of water during these storm events. So the hope would be to reduce that pumping or get rid of the pumping altogether and use those basins for infiltration. However, we don't have any data on how much water is currently being pumped out of those basins and how much additional water we would be able to capture during stormwater runoff periods. So we were not able to analyze this scenario past this point. So even though we were able to identify this as feasible scenario, it will not be considered further. And then I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Steve.
Thanks.
Before you start, Steve, there was one small thing that I thought bears mention. I mean, these 6 scenarios are at various stages along the development process. Some of them have been vetted and thought about more. Others are more conceptual. And one of the ones that's more conceptual is scenario number 1, which is the recharge project in the GSP, where we had identified potential basins in the northeast side of town. And the thing that I wanted to point out about that is that the locations of those basins are strictly conceptual at this point. There's been no conversations with the landowners, nor do we at this point plan on having further conversations. So they're just conceptually shown at those locations, but they could be somewhere else. They could be larger or they could be smaller. So we're simply trying to duplicate the project as laid out in the GSP.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss the evaluation and ranking of the projects of the 5 of the 6 projects that Kelly just described. So each project was evaluated against these 5 criteria, and the criteria are weighted as shown on the left. Effectiveness being weighted the highest, cost, risk, and uncertainty, and then promotion of groundwater sustainability and grant program priorities and preferences have just this a unit weighting. This is because effectiveness, cost, and risk and uncertainty are deemed to be more important of the 5 criteria. So looking at each of them on specifically on effectiveness, we look primarily at the impact of each alternative on the nitrate concentrations beneath the city. Nitrate is widespread and has a large impact across the shallow and upper deep aquifers. It's a good stand-in for general water quality improvements. We also did look at and model TCP and DBCP impacts from the alternatives. whether they had a positive impact on TCP and DBC concentrations below the city. There isn't as much data available there, and it's not, those contaminants aren't as widespread, but they were examined. The next 4 slides basically show you model outputs of the from each of 4 of the 5 scenarios, and I'll explain that in a minute. In the shallow zone and the upper deep zone. So these model outputs show the difference between a no action, a baseline scenario, as if none of these alternatives were implemented, and if they were implemented over 20, and then how that impact improved over 50 years. In this case, the scale on the right shows you the level of impact, meaning the best impact or the most improved water quality is blue at the bottom, reduction in nitrate concentration, and then if the nitrate concentration increased, then it would show up as a yellow or orange. Obviously, most of these scenarios are designed to improve groundwater quality. This basically shows the extent of the improvement and the level, concentration improvement. The folks that ran the model also used this information to calculate the volume of groundwater that was improved or prevented from reaching a point where it would no longer be useful as drinking water. And Mike can talk about that a little bit more if more information is needed. As you can see here, scenario 1 has which is the GSP project, infiltration of significant groundwater annually or every 3 years in the basins, the northeast part of the city. That shows a pretty significant impact across the city wellfield and over the 20 and 50 years. So scenario 2 is a review of the pumping at the RCR well and the impact there. Now, of course, it's shows a smaller impact, but it's a single well operating there over time, and so the impact shows this a lower level of impact, which we'll discuss against the nitrate concentrations. Sorry, that scenario 2, I was off. Scenario 2 references are well 14, yeah, the project, right. Thanks, Kelly. Sorry, I got mixed up on my scenarios. And it is Monday. So scenario 2, the impact there, and this is showing impact against nitrate. Now, scenario 2 is primarily targeting TCP, which has an impact there, but it is a more minor impact on groundwater quality. Scenario 3 is the RCR, improved RCR well. So we'll be pumping deeper from the near the RCR well, and so we can see the impact to the upper deep zone is some greater impact to the improved water quality from there than in the shallow zone, which is to be expected. And there is a improvement shown just from that single well pumping. Now, we don't have a slide for scenario 4, and that's because the improvements from scenario 4 were just not significant enough to show up in the model. So that will come up later as we talk about ranking. The next slide is scenario 5, the recharge near the basins at well 14. So similar to the impact from Aquifer Recharge from scenario 1, recharging water like we're proposing in scenario 5, it demonstrates a significant impact. And in this case, it's especially significant on the south end of the city where the recharge basins are located. And also where the new wells with scenario 5, the new upper deep zone wells for irrigation are proposed. So those are some of the model outputs. We've got obviously a lot more, and I'm sure Mike would be happy to expand upon that in the future. But for now, that's what we wanted to show to demonstrate the improved water quality. So the next slide shows our scenario, the project scenario scoring and ranking. The scenarios 3 and 5 scored the highest, and that's the new RCR well near the golf course and the Aquifer Recharge near well 14. And basically, this is a summary of all the scoring. Next slide is a summary of the each scenario and where they rank. The improvement to water, the volume of water improved is basically an order of magnitude higher for scenarios 1 and 5. The scenarios with managed aquifer recharge, which is to be expected because we're infiltrating a significant volume of water, of clean water, into the shallow zone there. The scenarios 2, 3, and 4 had lower volumes of water by about an order of magnitude improvement. The scenario 3, however, is ranked the highest, or is tied for the highest rank with scenario 5, because it does have an obvious benefit. It's got a very low cost and a very low risk and uncertainty, which are some of the categories that we compared it against. So for those reasons, it ranks highly. Scenario 5 also ranks highly because it has excellent performance, and the basins were already there, so it's a fairly low risk. The only issue there mostly is uncertainty about how much water we could get, surface water we could get from AID. Scenario 1 does have the best performance, but it has significant risk and uncertainty, mostly because we don't, as Mike stated, the property isn't currently owned by the city, and we don't know if AID can deliver as much water as was proposed in the GSP. And we're not sure if the project could be built underneath the current timing and deadlines for this grant. So there's a lot of risk and uncertainty there. So it's a good project, but it ranks lower for those reasons. In summary, then, our preferred project is a combination now of scenarios 3 and 5. They give us the best performance with the lowest, or at least as low as can be mitigated risk and uncertainty. And on the next slide, discusses sort of the benefits and kind of a description of those scenarios. And Kelly covered those pretty specifically, but there's a summary there. So these two projects combined would become our preferred project. We modeled the preferred project on the next slide, which shows some improved benefit from pumping at the RCR well due to the recharge occurring at the well 14 basin. So there's some benefit that the two projects don't have when they operate in the model separately, but they do have when they're especially in the upper deep zone. So you can see there's definitely an increased benefit for having the two scenarios operate simultaneously. The next slide is finally a summary of the preferred project, a map showing the preferred project, improvements to the well 14 basins, the pipeline, the new wells down gradient from the basins, and the replacement of the RCR well with a deeper RCR well to provide irrigation water for the golf course in the park. The next slide has a close-up of the work at the basins, and shows the pipeline connecting Centennial Basin to the new basins. Those basins would be, the easternmost basin runs about 13 or 14 feet deep. That would require some improvement to improve infiltration. The other two basins would be deepened to match in the 13 to 14 foot range, the other three basins, or the westernmost basin may just be expanded to the extent shown, and then deepened to provide extra capacity for recharge. The two wells are shown there to the south that would be installed to provide irrigation water for future city demand. The next slide shows some of the preferred project design assumptions. Some of our modeling, we modeled both a 600 acre foot per year recharge and 1,000 acre foot per year recharge. It really depends on how much water and for how long we can get it from AID. But either scenario provides a benefit to improving shallow groundwater there or south of the well 14 basins. The last slide I'll discuss here is the cost estimate for the preferred project. Basically, the top four costs or top five costs related to earthwork for the basins. We've got the pipeline and then 3 new wells: the RCR well and two future irrigation wells for irrigation or a purple pipe application. And the total cost at just over $6.3 million for the project. So at this point now, I'll turn it back over to Sarah to wrap up the presentation.
Yeah, so that's an overview of the feasibility study and really the entire project. And so the next steps are, first of all, to get any questions that you might have and or comments on the draft remedial investigation report or the draft groundwater tech memo. I noticed that we did have someone that joined later, Eddie Valero, and I'm just wondering if you had any questions. And if not, Ishmael or Robin, any questions about our presentation today?
I have no questions. Just again, thank you guys for all the work and getting us to this point. And I want to thank those that joined. County Supervisor Valero, thank you for joining this, and those that have called in by phone. Don't know who you are, but appreciate you joining us.
Wonderful. And Robin?
All right. Yeah, I have no comments. You know, I've seen this presentation once before, so good job, everyone, on the second run through.
Great. Okay, well then I'll pass it back to Trilby if you want to just wrap up the meeting.
All right, great. Great job, everybody, to the presenters, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. Again, this meeting is being recorded or has been recorded, so we will post that on the city's webpage on the website for the project. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of the project team members if you think of something later on. And thank you for joining us, and we will see you soon.